In this video and in a series of related video modules, we will talk about states, properties, and the difference between the two, as well as Simio processes and add-on processes, and how we can use add-on processes to enhance the logic of our simulation models. So more specifically, as for the objectives, we're going to extend the subway model that we have developed in previous video modules by adding bulking and type-based processing time, but this time using an alternative approach using add-on processes. So in order to be able to do these extensions, we first need to understand the difference between object states and properties. And we will also introduce Simio processes and their characteristics, and also learn how to use add-on process triggers or state assignments to extend or enhance the behavior of different components of our model. Now, before we go ahead and actually extend our model, we need to first understand some basic concepts and definitions regarding Simio. And specifically, I would like to talk about object states and properties, and then we'll talk about add-on processes and Simio processes. So, an object state is basically a value that is associated with the object's run space. And states or state variables, they can, or generally they do change over the simulation run. So during the simulation, the value of these object states change. So some of the examples are model entity priority. So the priority of your model entity can change as the entity is processed through the system. Or model entity dot picture, or the picture or symbol of your model entity, which can change at different stages in your model. And another example of a state variable is the number of entities in the queue of a server. So, for example, if we have a server called server 1, then the state variable that contains or records the number in queue for this server is has this expression that you can see here. So server1.inputBuffer.contents.number waiting. And as you can imagine, this value will change as you process entities throughout your simulation run. Object properties, on the other hand, there are also values associated with the object instance or instances. However, they do not change during the simulation run. So most of the times object properties are set at the beginning of the simulation run, and they cannot change. They won't change as the system changes or as the simulation time evolves. Examples of these object properties are model entity, initial priority, which is set at the beginning of the run. So as you can see, the initial property of the model entity, initial priority of the model entity is a property. It cannot change. However, the state variable, which is model entity.priority, can change during the simulation run. Also, initial capacity of a server is another example of object properties. So if I go to Simio, when you click on your, for example, server object, you will see its properties on the right-hand side in the properties tab here. So the type of capacity, initial capacity of the server, ranking rule, these are all properties of a server. if you, for example, go to model entity and then definitions, you will be able to see different states or state variables associated with your model entity. So, for example, you can see a picture here, which is basically the symbol of your model entity, which is a state variable. And if you actually click on the properties tab here, you will see all the properties associated with your model entity. Properties and states are not exclusive to objects. Your model also has states and properties. So if you click on the model, you can actually see the states of your model and also properties associated with your model. The other important concept that we need to understand, or at least know how it works, is Simio processes. So in general, a process is a set of actions that happen over time during the simulation run, and they can change the state of the system, or in other words, they can change one or more state variables that you use to define the state of your system. So Simio processes have several characteristics. Each process has a triggering event associated with it. So this is an event that basically executes the process. Tokens execute the process, and each process has one or more steps in it, which are basically the actions that take place. So one thing that we need to know is that all Simio objects that you see in the standard library are built using Simio processes. So for example, if I go to my single server queuing model, and if I click on the server object and subclass, and go to, so you can see I have my server object here, and I can go to the processes, and here you can see all the processes that define the behavior of your server object. So these are all the logic behind how your server object works. And in fact, if you, let me go ahead and talk about one of these. So for example, this one that you can see here is the unentered input buffer process, and this process is triggered when the input buffer or when an entity enters the input buffer. So you can see input buffer.entered. So whenever an entity enters the input buffer of a server, you can see all the different steps that are executed when this event happens. So these are built-in processes in Simio. So all of the objects in your standard library have basically a lot of processes that are used to define their behaviors. Now, add-on processes or user-defined processes are used to modify or extend the functionality or behavior of your objects. So for example, I can go to my model, and I can click on my server object and go to add-on process triggers, and now I can modify the behavior of my server in different ways. So for example, if I want to add a logic to how my server behaves when an entity enters the server object, I can simply double click on this entered add-on process trigger, and as you can see, Simio automatically creates an add-on process, and I can go ahead and use and add steps to my add-on process. So for example, let's say I want to make a decision when an entity enters the server object, and then make an assignment and basically change one or more state variables. As you can see, there are different steps that we can use in add-on process. So these are the common steps, and in fact, if you click on the all steps, you can see all different steps that we can use to modify or define, to modify the behavior of our objects or define an add-on process. So as you can see, this add-on process is run when an entity enters the server. So basically what we're doing here is that if I go back to my server object, and if you look closely, you will see that one of these steps is execute add-on process entered, or entered add-on process. So the logic that we just defined in our add-on process will be added here in the logic for my server object. That's how an add-on process modifies or extends the behavior of your server object. So now that we are familiar with Simio processes and add-on processes, model states, object states, and also properties, we can go ahead and start modifying our original subway model, which is what we're going to do next in the follow-up video modules.